June 23rd, 2016 was a very important day. The U.S. presidential election was in full swing. Democrats were in the middle of a sit-in on gun control, but the biggest news of the day was the holding of the Brexit referendum. In this project, we will plan to address why Brexit happened, but first, we need to know the basics. What is Brexit? Brexit is the common term for the United Kingdom's decision to leave the European Union. But why would they want to leave? What is the European Union? The European Union, or EU for short, is an institution that seeks to unite the countries in Europe through labor, trade, and travel. Let's go back to 1951. Europe is still in shambles after World War II, and the leaders of Europe want to ensure that Europe doesn't go to war again. With the idea that countries that are dependent on each other are much less likely to fight each other, 6 countries, Belgium, Germany, France, Italy, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, decide to come together to form the European Coal and Steel Community. Later on, in 1957, they would also form the European Economic Community and European Atomic Energy Community. Later, this group was renamed the European Union. In 1973, 3 more countries became members, one of which being the United Kingdom. Since that time, many countries have joined, typically in waves, bringing the grand total of countries in the European Union to 28. The EU limits tariffs and trade restrictions between member countries, allows easy travel between all of the member countries, allows people to work across borders, and creates a common currency, among other things. The EU makes most of its major changes through treaties, which are discussed and passed by all of the member countries before being signed and eventually going into effect. One example of an EU treaty, and one that happens to be particularly relevant to Brexit, is the Treaty of Lisbon. This treaty was signed in 2007 and came into effect in 2009. The main purpose of this treaty was to give the European Union a stronger, more united voice, and to lay out what powers belong to the EU, what belongs to its member countries, and what is shared. But that's not why it's important. As part of the Treaty of Lisbon, an article was created and approved, Article 50, which gave countries the power to leave the European Union and laid out a couple of guidelines for what would happen next. The article says that once the country declares that they plan to leave the EU, they have 2 years to negotiate their exit. So now that we have all this, we can go back to Brexit. How did the UK's decision come to be? Many factors, cultural, economic, and political, played a role. One major force behind the Leave movement was a very small far-right party called the United Kingdom Independence Party, or UKIP for short, and their very vocal leader, Nigel Farage. As will be explained in this video, all these stresses came together at once, leading to a referendum being voted on by the entire UK and the Leave vote passing.
So why did the UK leave? We're going to look at some data real quick and then give explanations. The first thing we're going to look at is turnout among younger people and older people. If you look at the data below, the blue is leave and the yellow is remain. As you get older and older, you can tell that the leave percentage goes up. So among voters 18 through 24, we have 73% voting to remain, meaning to stay in the EU. Whereas once you get to 65 plus, 60% are voting to leave. So to have Britain and the UK leave the EU. This is a trend throughout data, and you can see as the older you get, the more likely you are to vote to leave.
For the remaining demographic data, we'll compare 2 very polar cities in England, London and Boston. London voted only about 25% leave, while Boston voted... Let me just start over for a second. I'm sorry. I did not know what I was reading. Was I on the right slide? For the remaining demographic data, we will compare 2 very polar cities in England, London and Boston. London voted only about 25% leave, while Boston voted about 75% leave. Regarding education, 68.4% of London's population has a bachelor's degree, while only 15.1% of Boston's population has a bachelor's degree. Regarding income, the average income of someone living in London is £52,083, while the average income of someone living in Boston is £18,432. Regarding immigration, 37% of London's population is foreign-born, while only 15% of Boston's population is foreign-born. To make sense of this data and how it could have affected the success of Brexit, we'll put it in perspective with British culture, economy, and politics.
One big part of the UK's decision to leave is the general cultural beliefs in the EU. What I mean by this is that the way people think and their values played a big role in this decision. What it really boils down to is nationalism. What this means is basically that British people have a strong sense of being British as their identity. And many people feel that the EU, which is basically all these different countries together, kind of compromises that sense of, I am British. As we learned earlier, a big part of the EU is that you're a citizen. As we learned earlier, a big part of the EU is that if you are a citizen of any country in the EU, you can live and work anywhere. Many people in the UK see this as a threat to British identity. In terms of why this idea is seen as a threat, you kind of have to think like a patriotic Briton. If you believe that your identity is fixed with your position as a British citizen, then you would not look too kindly to other people from other countries entering your country. They see immigration as a loss of British identity. For example, there's a large Muslim population in Britain. In areas that have a heavy Muslim population, such as London, there are often Muslim sectors. In these areas, Sharia law is often practiced, the religion is Islam, and the language is often Arabic. For people who see the British identity as being Christians who speak English, then you can see why this might turn you off to the EU. These outsiders, who come in with their own cultures, religion, and language, in these people's eyes, are causing Britain to lose its Britishness. To review, the EU encourages immigration, people living and working all over. For many, this is a great thing, and people love it. But for others, they feel like it destroys their country's identity. In Britain, the sense of being British is this sort of cultural identity. It's really strong. It's this idea that, because you live in Britain, that's who you are. And therefore, having other people from other countries immigrating in really threatens this, and people don't like that.
Now let's move on to economic reason for Brexit's success. The right, predominantly in favor of Brexit, wanted to leave the EU so the UK would be open to trade with the rest of the world more easily. They are also concerned with increased immigration for a wide array of reasons, such as unemployment, wanting to pick people with the most to offer to enter the country, and xenophobia. Another reason for Brexit's success is the general public's opinion of Britain's economy. The leave vote percentage is much higher in regions of Britain that are affected by a growth in imports, especially like textiles and electronic goods. These imports, which are from China especially, are competition for home industries that have been struggling for the last 30 years. One explanation for the focus of immigration in the public opinions of Brexit is that the government's inability to help the workers that are negatively affected by globalization push voters toward political entrepreneurs who show nationalist and anti-immigrationist ideologies. British people were also discontent with the EU because of large public debts and limited reform. Europe's economic growth is very slow and unemployment is really high. Wages and job security have severely diminished for many workers, especially in Britain recently, and they blame it on the growth of immigration from poor, formerly communist EU countries such as Poland. Of course, this can be explained partly by economic reasons and partly by the cultural reasons explained before. Our final reason for Brexit's success is political. This reason largely deals with Euroscepticism, which is an ideology of distrust for the EU. There is a trend in Britain of blaming Brussels, where the EU is centered, for most problems, and a recurring desire for national sovereignty. The gist of right-wing skepticism of the EU is that the UK should control its own borders, have self-determination, and not be told what to do from miles away by an unelected bureaucrat in Brussels. However, this is not a solely right-wing ideology. Some far left believe that the EU is anti-democratic and unreformable, so they also vote to leave.
These three areas are connected not just with the data, but with each other as well. For example, economic problems for workers lead to xenophobia and cultural distrust. which then lead to a desire for national sovereignty and political discontentment.
To put that in layman's terms, basically what we're getting at is we've given you this information as three very different concepts. We have political reasons, economic reasons, cultural reasons, but the way society functions as a culture is really this one big mass. So if we think about political reasons, for example, people don't necessarily like the way politicians are talking about things, and that really ties into a lot of economic issues, right? Because people, as people, want to make money, which leads into the issue of immigration. A lot of people don't like immigrants because they feel they're coming in and taking low-paying jobs. This leads into like economic issues, though. For example, maybe you want to leave the EU because you feel like the immigration policies are causing you to lose money because you're losing your job. These ideas are not mutually exclusive. What we're saying is that they all tie together into this kind of messy issue, and that's why we've separated them for you. If we look at issues like national identity, a lot of that plays into things like politics and economics and the way your country runs. If you think of Britain as everyone else has the euro and they have like the pound. And I think a lot of things fit together, and it's not just looking at, oh, it's an economic issue, or oh, it's politics. It's everything working together, and that can be a little hard to understand. So we've really broken things for you, but in reality, they're messy, they tie together. We have economics feeding into cultural reasons because that's the way people think, and we have politics feeding into everything else because it's the way society is governed and functions. If we take a moment to look back at our data and we think of back to Boston versus London, Boston is an area, where people are probably typically working lower paid jobs, and you have immigrants coming in and taking these jobs in a sense. I mean, it's likely that in these areas, because as we saw earlier, the diversity in those areas isn't necessarily it's not necessarily more diverse in those areas, but people who are working these lower paying jobs likely feel that their jobs are being taken. And if we think about it in terms of these areas, you can see that like the city of London, which tends to be diverse and young, these are people who want to leave. And it ties into those issues of economics and politics and culture. The culture in these places is different. If we look at education, this goes into what people are learning when they're being educated. And if you think about it, this ties into the economic thing because people who are more educated tend to work higher paying jobs and tend to live in places and cities. Anyways, that's how things really fit together. Thank you for listening to our video.
Thanks a lot. All right.